Hello, good afternoon, and thanks so much for being here. My name is Garrett McQueen. I'm the Director of Artist Equity for the American Composers Orchestra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's professional development session titled Fine Print, our Media Rights and Unions workshop featuring today Alicia Lawyer, Corey Field, and Melissa Nahn. The music that we were all enjoying there was an excerpt from Restrung by Tommy Docherty, performed by the American Composers Orchestra. I selected that recording for us today because it's a phenomenal composition, first and foremost, but it's also a great example of a piece that we're actually able to share with you through this webinar medium. One of the important aspects of our earshot readings is that we ensure that the recordings that come from those readings can be used by composers for personal, professional, or archival purposes based on the existing agreements with our own musicians and the musicians of our partner orchestras. An understanding of agreements like those is a vital part of expanding your career as a composer, and I'm extremely excited for us all to learn a little bit more about that topic today. Earshot readings are, of course, just one aspect of ACO's Earshot. Earshot is the nation's first systemic program for building relationships between orchestras and composers through our Earshot readings and also through collaboratory fellowships, consortium commissions, and professional development sessions like this one. Earshot expands the definition of American orchestral music to ensure a vibrant and inclusive future. Earshot is a program of American Composers Orchestra completed in partnership with the American Composers Forum, the League of American Orchestras, and New Music USA. Composers for our Earshot readings are selected through an open call with no fee or age limit. We're delighted to welcome many of them here today. All of our Earshot professional development sessions are open to the public. For the full list of topics we covered this season, go over to our website, americancomposers.org. A few housekeeping notes. I'm sure you may have many questions or comments that come to mind over the course of this presentation. So if you wouldn't mind offering those using the Q&A function here on Zoom as we go along, we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. If you'd like to come on screen and ask your question live, feel free to use the hand raise function here on Zoom and keep your hand raised until you come on screen, and we'll bring as many of you to the stage as we can and as time allows. As a follow-up to this session, we will be offering materials for you to review, which will be available on our website at a later date, so be sure to check back and stay tuned for those. I'll also be offering a survey in the chat at the conclusion of today's presentation, so if you wouldn't mind clicking that link when it appears and offering your feedback, it will be much appreciated. And then with that, I'd like to pass things over to Melissa Nahn, our President and CEO, who will introduce today's speakers and help moderate today's conversation. Hello, Melissa.
Hello, thank you so much, Garrett, for that warm introduction, and greetings to everyone. Thank you for being here. This is a wonderful conversation that we are having, and I'm really grateful to be here with two lawyers. You're going to see why I said that in a second. The first one is an actual lawyer, Corey Field. Corey, welcome. So Corey practices entertainment, media, copyright, and trademark law and represents clients in all areas of the entertainment industry. Before becoming an attorney, he was an executive in the international music publishing business, and he's also a wonderful composer himself. I can attest to this from having listened to his music. If you are interested in learning more, check out his book, Entertainment Law, Fundamentals and Practice, and we're going to pop a link in the chat for you, or visit him at coreyfieldlaw.com. Corey, welcome. I am grateful for you every day.
Hi.
Hi. And now for our second lawyer, Alicia Lawyer.
No.
Bad joke. So sorry. So I'm not Alicia. Alicia, I'm going to introduce you and embarrass you with your bio. Named by Musical America as one of classical music's top 30 influencers for 2015 and a Laureate Oboe artist in 2019. Texas native Alicia Lawyer is the founder, artistic director, and principal oboist of ROCO, a professional music ensemble that flexes from 1 to 40 musicians from around the US and Canada, including guest conductors from around the world. Expanding the repertoire, ROCO has commissioned and world premiered over 100 works from living composers. The group performs dozens of concerts annually in multiple venues throughout Houston, many of which are broadcast nationally and live streamed to the world. Known as the most fun you can have with serious music, ROCO has been called a trailblazer and arts disruptor and is leading the sector in innovation. Alicia, it is always a joy to be with you. Welcome.
Thank you. And I'm not a lawyer. That's just my name.
my God.
Thank you for the clarification. Well, it is a thrill to be here with you both. And Corey, you're here because of your incredible expertise in the field. Alicia, you're here because of the incredible investments you've made in media rights and in commissioning on behalf of composers. And those things are so strongly linked for all the reasons we'll talk about. But one of the reasons why this conversation is so important to us, because our mission is really composer advancement on the national level, is a recognition that the idea of creating a recording with an orchestra. If you're a composer who's just getting started writing for orchestra, or if you've been at it a long time and are simply writing a piece that you are having premiered for the first time, getting that recording out there can be one of the most critical things towards having it programmed again. And so for us to be able to understand how that can happen and how composers can best be partners to orchestras in that conversation, we wanted to make sure that everyone has as clear of as possible of an understanding as to how this tends to work. So I'm going to switch over to screen share now for a moment and get into our presentation for today. So first things first, we wanted to make sure that we kind of get at the idea of what we are going to be discussing here in terms of media rights for composers. So I will say this is a topic that could take many, many years to unpack. We're going to really focus on the intersection of media rights, composers, and orchestras very specifically. So we're going to go over the idea of archival and personal use, including personal use in the form of, private submissions for grant applications. We're going to talk about promotional use, which means public posting, either in short form excerpts, like 3 to 5 minutes, or in a work's entirety. We're going to deal with commercial release. So commercial release means you're releasing it in such a way that people can download it and pay for it. So it could be streaming services where you're able to download, or it could be in the form of CDs, vinyl, those things that still exist. And we're going to talk a little bit about broadcasting and also licensing and fees, because of course, as composers, you're going to want to know how you get paid for such things. So Corey, I want to pass to you now and just chat through the different types of licensing with respect to media. If you could share some definitions on these two things.
Oh, sure. And I really do want to start by just saying how great and what a golden era the ACO is implementing in this country. I am astonished at the performances, the collaborations with other orchestras, the performances, the care with which this entire topic of making sure composers have this professional boost. It's just incredible. And ROCO as well. These two organizations are defining, what it means to nurture great music in America. And I know that's a lofty phrase, but I need to acknowledge that. I don't take for granted that this is even happening today. And I also want to thank everybody for participating. I was looking at the list of participants. It's a wonderful group. It looks like it's very diverse. We even have some people from unions listening. So it's a really great, well-rounded group here today. I want, as Melissa mentioned, I started out as, first a wannabe composer, and then I was fortunate enough to work in classical music publishing. And I had a chance firsthand to observe the transition from composers who were not widely recognized to composers who then were published by the company I worked for and were entering the entire world of professional stuff. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. Is we're not really focusing on the music. We're talking about the professional stuff, and that means money, kind of, to a significant degree. And for some of you, this is second nature. You've made the decision that you're going, and you've acquired the knowledge, or you have a publisher, or you're self-published and have the skills, and you're in that place where you are very fine-tuned to turning things like media into some combination of artistic opportunity and business transaction. Others are not there yet. Others of you would literally happily, and probably should, give away lots of rights in order to get something played and recorded. And that's okay. That's probably the norm for people who need to start out, because in the arts, we always have this devil's bargain. You all know the phrase. The phrase is, it will be good exposure for you, right? So, that's kind of what we're talking about, is entering this world where you're dealing at a very high, reasonably high professional level. The ACO fits that definition 100%. And what that means is, for part of the topic today, is that you're going to be dealing with rights holders, organizations that represent and protect musicians, and guess what? They want to be sure that their constituency is professionally compensated. And that means it can be expensive. I will tell you before I'm now going to talk about the slide, but if money were no object, you wouldn't need to be on this webinar, and we wouldn't need to give it. Because what would happen is there'd be plenty of money for orchestras to pay union musicians who are the best in the world, and to perform and record stuff, and to make whatever uses that they can make under those union agreements, and happily pay for them. And in a way, that would be an ideal world where you wouldn't need me to tell you about how it all works all that much, because the money would be there. And so I just wanted to set the tone for all of you composers. You're creating art, you're living that life, and this is a conversation about the more business money side of that life of yours. So I do want to be sure I'm kind of focusing it properly. Licensing types. Okay. Sorry for the long rant. But licensing types. Music is governed by copyright law, and all of you know what that means. It means you own the stuff you create, unless you happen to have given rights or ownership to someone else, typically a music publisher, if you've done that. Not everyone has or will. And copyright law divides up music into what you do with it. If you perform music, you go to the performing rights organizations, ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, GMR, and they handle the transaction, the money that results from a live performance, a performance on radio or television or on the web or mobile devices. And so performance goes that direction. If you are making a recording and the composer and publisher want to be paid based on how often the recording is streamed or once upon a time sold, then you go a different direction. You go to organizations like the Mechanical Licensing Collective, like the Harry Fox Agency, or directly to the copyright owner. If you want a synchronization license, which is very simply combining music with audiovisual images, videos, you go to the copyright owner. There's no organization in most cases. So synchronization licensing, to actually address the slide, is music combined with video. YouTube is a good example. Mechanical licensing is if your professionally released audio recording is being streamed on Spotify or Apple Music, and it's a particular type of stream, there's a royalty that goes to you and your publisher, or yourself if you're your own publisher. So sync is videos, mechanical is commercial recordings.
Perfect. And now some clarifying questions from the peanut gallery from me, which is in mechanical licensing, trick question, how are those licensing fees negotiated?
Okay, well, I did mention copyright. I should have a copy of. Let me get it. I have a copy of the Copyright Act right here. So this is the book that has copyright law that answers Melissa's question, because believe it or not, I mean, it's a very strange thing that the music industry is insanely heavily regulated by this book. And among the things in that book are the actual rates that are paid for mechanical licensing. So if you have a recording, for the most part, it's the law, so there's always an exception to the rule. But for the most part, if you are licensing a record label to include your composition on a recording, ultimately the amount of money you will receive in almost all cases, not all, but almost all, is actually in this book.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And Corey, we will share. There's a question in the chat about the title and the author of the book. We'll share that as part of our resources afterwards as well. But yeah, can you give us that verbally?
Oh yeah, this is the Copyright Law of the United States of America, and it's online. You can go to copyright.gov, which is the Copyright Office, and it's all there for free. You know,
Brilliant.
I'm not sure they even print it anymore. It's kind of an old copy.
Brilliant. Okay. And so, so basically, it sounds like what you're saying is those fees, in large part, broadly speaking, are somewhat standardized.
For mechanicals, synchronization licensing for videos is whatever the copyright owner negotiates. There is nothing set, except with the exception of public broadcasting, PBS. That is the one big exception, although actually a tiny exception. But for PBS, it is possible for a PBS production to create a video with some copyrighted music in it and to pay according to very arcane, hard to find parts of the copyright law. Yeah.
Great. And since we might have some folks who are here representing performers, some people who are composers, just to be really clear what we're talking about here when it comes to licensing. This is what the creator or composer of the work will receive for licensing that work to be used in this context. And some things that may have surprised people with sync licensing, you might think of, okay, so it's music that goes behind something visual. So you might think, okay, that's a film, that's a video game. But it's actually also if you are having a performance of your piece that has been captured on video and is being broadcast on YouTube, that's one version. It could also be a situation where, let's say that you are presenting your music and you are talking about it in a panel discussion like this one, and the audio plays, right? That's another way that that can show up. So there are many different forms of how sync licensing can happen. It's pretty much anytime you have that playing behind something that's visual.
I do want to qualify that slightly, because if it's purely live, like if on this Zoom we had music, which we did, let's say you weren't recording it, okay? Or completely live television, let's say it's Olympic ice skating and it's live, there is no synchronization license. It's just a live performance that is being streamed or broadcast. And as I said earlier, that would be covered by performing rights organizations such as ASCAP or BMI. It's only when you have video that is fixed. And of course, in today's world, they're all fixed. Sorry, talking like a lawyer, apologies. Fixed meaning, you know, you push the record button. No, sorry, there is no record button. It's really hard to talk in 2023, isn't it? But you know what I mean.
So Corey, I think the distinction you're making is that when you leave something up, right? When it's available for people, that's where it starts to play in. So that's a great distinction. And in case anyone's wondering how complicated the rest of this session is going to be, there you are. There's one beginning. So let's talk about who's involved. And we're going to focus this particular slide on who's involved from the orchestra side. So for those who may not be familiar, the American Federation of Musicians is the union that represents musicians nationally. And you'll have sort of two bodies in this, the local, which is in each city, and the national, which is primarily responsible actually for negotiating the bulk of the media rights between orchestra musicians and orchestras across the country. So we'll get into what that looks like in a minute. You'll also be working with the orchestra itself, so represented by the administration of the orchestra, so that's staff, and then also within that, the personnel manager, whose job it is to basically enact the things that are in the agreements between the union and the orchestra itself. And then also the orchestra committee, which actually has some really important roles within the process of media agreements and how they are carried forward. So we'll get into those specifics a bit as well. And then, of course, you have the composer and the publisher, and that is in the case that the composer actually has a publisher. So Corey, as you were saying, whoever happens to hold the rights or the copyright is the person that you're going to be dealing with. Any things that you would add to the conversation on this one, Corey?
Well, you know, there's even more people involved. Like if, you know, like on this slide, if the conductor or the guest artist has an exclusive recording agreement, then usually their record deal, so to speak, will say you can't go making videos for other people. You need our permission. So you may have to, in some cases, go to the record label of a conductor or a guest artist. You know, in the background of your question is venues and stagehands. There's other unions that can be involved. There are some halls, I think Carnegie Hall is one of them, where there are some obligations for media rights to the the other union personnel, like the Teamsters or IATSE, involved, and of course, the union agreements themselves have, as you were going to mention and have, they've got rates for the additional recording privileges. I mean, basically, the more uses, and publishers work the same way as unions, oddly enough, because the more uses you make, the more they charge. Because there's a perceived value in that. And we're going to hear more about that from Alicia, who is very active in the space of creating value with the many videos of her performances.
Yeah, that's great. And so basically what we're trying to get across here, this is not an exhaustive list of everybody who could be involved, but I think the point is you might be thinking about, as a composer, the idea that you're going to be having a conversation with the orchestra who is commissioning and performing your work, or just performing your work if it's a repeat performance, about media rights, but there are actually all of these additional parties. So, anybody who might have an artistic hand or a logistical hand in producing that recording, there will be permissions required to make that happen. So in many cases, those permissions would be negotiated with the orchestra itself. So you wouldn't necessarily be involved directly in that, but it's helpful for you to know that that exists, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I just want to do a very quick shout out. I know it's not completely on point, but if you use singers and you're making a recording, they may be in a different union, either SAG-AFTRA, most commonly, especially here in Los Angeles, or AGMA, which is the American Guild of Musical Artists. One of my clients is a well-known professional chorus, and they're AGMA. But I know that we're talking primarily about orchestras, but you should all be so lucky as to write a choral symphony and get it recorded. So there will be other unions involved.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always great to plan for growth. So if your head is not spinning yet, we're going to add more layers of complexity to the conversation. So we want to talk about first what most orchestras will have access to. And when I say most, I'm talking about those who have signed on to the Integrated Media Agreement, which is the agreement that has been negotiated with the AFM on the national level. And so I'm using that as sort of a shorthand for how many orchestras operate. It's not going to be true with every orchestra, so you'll want to make sure that you check all of this with them. And I'll also say, as Corey mentioned, we have many wonderful colleagues in the chat, so please feel free to chin check me on any of this, because these terms, they change a lot, and also they can be applied differently. So I welcome any corrections or comments in the chat. But basically, the thing to get across here is that when you're a composer working with an individual artist or with a chamber ensemble, and you want to have that piece recorded and put out there on YouTube or something like that, you might find that that's a natural part of the conversation. One thing that you might figure out as you're starting to work with orchestras is that there isn't as easy or free of a way to get a full recording of your piece out there in public view on YouTube without certain permissions and fees being paid. So as we talk about this, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a really easy, free way to do that. You have to move through the process because, of course, it's about compensating musicians for the value that is in that recording. So let's talk, though, about in the current version of that Integrated Media Agreement, which is negotiated on the national level. There are some things that you do have access to as a composer underneath this, assuming that the orchestra has approved that and we're in good shape. So there should be an agreement between you and the orchestra that outlines all of this in writing so that everyone's on the same page about what you have access to. But what can be typical is that you would have access to archival use or private use. So what that means is that you're able to use that recording privately for your own study, listen to it and all of that, and keep it for yourself, but not post it publicly on your own page. So personal use doesn't mean I can personally use it on my website. That's not what that means. And in that case, approval is required from the orchestra to make that case. So then what can also be included in that is that if you have a grant application, you may have the permission to share that privately as an unlisted link that cannot be shared outside of the context of that grant application so that a panel can review that full recording. So already there's some value there. And in many cases, the orchestra is not paying more for that to be the case. Now we get to promotional use. So depending on what version of the IMA the orchestra is on, it might be 3 minutes, it might be 5 minutes, but in many cases you would have access to an excerpt of your work, which the orchestra committee would need to approve that usage that you could put out there, or the orchestra could put out there on their YouTube channel. And then from that point, once it's out there, you can relink it on your own page because it's publicly available. So that is a way for you to share samples of the work and how it was recorded during a live performance. Okay, great. And then, oh, that was a fun little shift there. Okay, and then we have local radio broadcast. So no approval is required for this, but it is contextually possible within the current version of the IMA so that happens simultaneous with the performance or on demand for 30 days, and it doesn't require approval as well. Okay, very good. So that's what's available typically without additional cost. And there is a payment that can be made from the orchestra to the musicians, which is on top of what they would typically pay for a performance. So we're giving some samples here of what that can look like: 6% of their weekly salary if they're a salaried orchestra, or 48% of their per performance scale with an actual minimum in there. So what we're trying to get across here is not so much that it's important that you know exactly how much that is, but more that you're aware of the idea that when an orchestra says to you, we would like to release this full recording for promotional use, which means public use without people paying for it, or that we want to actually release it commercially. So for downloads, for CDs, that there's an extra payment that they're making to their musicians for that right. Okay, and so inside of the current IMA, all of those things, they call it multi-platform for a reason. They're actually able to release to YouTube, to SoundCloud, to Spotify, in all of those formats except television in perpetuity, which is kind of wonderful because previous versions, there might have been a time limit, or there might have been restrictions on, this rate for this type of usage and this rate for that type of usage. So it kind of simplifies the process all around. And there is an approval process the orchestra committee needs to go through. So the management would propose to the orchestra committee what it plans to do in advance. The orchestra committee says yes or no, and then everybody moves forward. So one of the things that I'm trying to get across here is the orchestra has paid for this, but what's beneficial about the agreement that's been reached with the AFM is that there's now a sort of broad simplification of how the orchestra can use that recording, and therefore, once it's out there, how you can point to it as a composer as well. So I'm going to pause there for a second, take a breath. That was a lot of information. And then one of the things that I also want to share too is that what I'm most excited to have Alicia on here, because Roko has done a beautiful job of manifesting this, like of actually making a large scale commitment to everything they do being in recorded form. So Alicia, I want to welcome you to the conversation here to share a little bit about how Roko does this.
Thank you. Well, I think the background you need to know about me is for about 10 years before I founded Roko, I was personnel manager for 3 other startups. So I was, a hardcore on union side in the best possible way, and was principal oboe in those groups too. And so what's been interesting is when I started my own orchestra, which started because my church renovated, I went to the union because they were my buddies. And I said, what should I do? Because I don't really want or need to do a CBA because we're starting to pay above union wages. I want to throw money at the problem, which is a little weird, but that's how it started. And I think that's important because when we first started our first concert in 2005, we recorded it, and I wanted to be able to use that recording and not have people pay for it. And that was kind of the critical piece of this is all of our content. If you go on our site, we have over 1,000 musical tracks we've paid the rights for. And so I wanted it to be available since access is our #1 value to the world for free. And our model actually, just so you know, is 97% donated dollars for our budget and 3% ticket sales. So it's not transactional, and it is scalable. We're at a $2 million budget. But I'm just saying this to say that when we first started, we recorded every piece to be able to leave up, and we talked to union, or I did, and said, what should we charge? So we basically started paying limited pressing for every single concert we've ever played to musicians, which is over the amount. I'm not obviously going to say how much we pay because that's a union thing, but it's over that. And we've been paying that for 18 years. And then in 2013, which is another piece of this, we started live streaming way ahead of the pandemic, pre-pandemic prepared. We were live streaming in 2013, which proposed another situation that I talked to the union for. And then we just added a video limited pressing for musicians. So on the musician side, we paid for all those rights all of these years. If you go to our listening room, it's probably a $7 million investment that we leave up for free listening all over the world. Now that we use QR codes in our city to, it's a long story. There's so much going on there, but we paid for all these rights and then started doing the sync licensing. But because we commission so much, we're actually at 132 world premiere commissions. Because we commission, we try to bake into that contract some sync license rights as well, because as Corey did say, it is pretty much the Wild West of our field of what fees there are. There are people who have commissioned for thousands and thousands of dollars who on the other side of it want thousands and thousands of dollars for a sync license just to leave up for free. And the other small piece you need to know is we do not charge for our live streams. It is not a charge and you don't even register your email. So that's also different. It's a different model and other orchestras that try to kind of make money off of the streams. Again, content available for free access. So that's a critical piece for you guys to know as a composer. Yes, okay. I already said all that, okay. Yeah, and so during COVID, we didn't have to change anything. And we're at 132 now, but this is a group that gives us money for commissioning, even though, just so you guys know, as composers, we bake commissioning money into our general operating. It's not a separate fund, so. Okay, next one. What else am I supposed to say? Yeah, the QR codes have been really interesting to all our different playlists, composers of color, female composers, and sliced and diced in beautiful ways to be able to be free to the public.
That's really great. And Alicia, I want to ask you, what has it meant to Roku to record everything in terms of your institutional health, in terms of who's seeing you, like in terms of financials? What has that meant for Roku?
I think that our content is still, it's not just, it's a way, especially for commissions and composers, to have a professional recording done. I mean, it's a fully professional orchestra recording that is able to be used on your website when we commission you, and you can have access to it. I think that's what's been interesting, is to see the trajectory. It's also been really interesting seeing us live stream since 2013 with like 2 static cameras, and now to have a jib flying over us and all these things, and maybe some drones at some point. And just kind of leaning into technology as we've grown. I think that's been fascinating. So in some ways it's a chronology of our growth artistically, as well as visually.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And can you break down how you handle the recording process in terms of how you're releasing it? So you're live streaming, and then what platforms are you putting it on afterwards in recorded form?
We go through Orchard, so they do the fees. They take care of a lot of the things that we do. We are ASCAP BMI. We do all the, our librarian has a critical role of making sure, talking to the publishers, telling them what use we were going to do before, during, and after. Having the live streaming licenses and the mechanical license. Oh my stars! But the librarian has a big piece of work that he used to not have when we first started. It was a lot easier with audio. Video is difficult. And I will say that the sync licensing, I mean, it's not just a Wild West of cost. It actually is a Wild West of trying to reach the right person to give you the actual cost, or even the approval to leave it up. There's a piece on our YouTube that I'm like, we have 13 emails to 12 different people trying to say, we're ready to give you money to leave this up in sync license. And until you answer, it's just really frustrating to not sometimes even know who is the point person. And this is a living composer too, which is, it's harder sometimes with the recently passed away composers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And, as you're thinking about where the music exists, so it's on YouTube, of course, where else can people access your recordings right now?
Yeah, so we live stream on 6 different channels, again, for free. It's YouTube embedded in our site, and YouTube and Facebook and Classical FM, and this thing called A440 that's starting to become more and more popular. And then one other, I can't remember the name, but so 6 different channels live. And then we have the pieces that we then break apart and get the sync license for and leave the pieces up. So
fantastic. And then
it's so much work after the concert.
Yeah, that makes sense. And are you also having it available for download as well? So places like, or releasing it commercially, or is it just the streaming?
It's just the streaming. I think there's one site that is but the thing, it's for download on one place, but it's all streaming on every other place, and Orchard, especially the places they send it out to. What's interesting though, is we have paid the musicians for 10,000 downloads of every piece we've ever played for 18 years. And we'll never get there. So that's been an interesting conundrum as well. I heard about something about, there was a lady, I know you guys, we talked about this. There was a lady that's kind of tried to bundle groups together to do some collective bargaining with publishers about sync licensing to kind of more regulate that cost, because that is really needed. I mean, it has varied so much from like $100 for in perpetuity to $5,000 for a year for a piece to live up for free. And it's just hard to budget that, right? And you don't really know it until you get closer to that.
Yeah. So just as a reminder, when the licensing you're talking about is a licensing that goes to the composer or the publisher for the right to put their music out there on video in recorded form.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay. And then can you talk about how that shows up in your commissioning agreements? What are some of the things that you ask for? Because a lot of this really should be set forth right away.
Yeah, just that we both have veto power of use of it, that they can do some editing, a little bit of editing if they, I mean, we have a lot of coughs and things, I don't know, all the pollen in Houston, and just getting it polished that way. And then they just give us, I try to put in that it's perpetuity. I don't see the point of it not being in perpetuity, since we're leaving it up for free. We're not charging for it. But I understand leaving it up and the more use of it does create value. So I will say that out of our 132 commissions, almost all of those are recommissions, so it's developing a relationship. That's important to say. But yeah, it's really just in there. It says that, we're going to live stream on all these channels. They're available. I also put in that if the commission is for the piece, and that if we are asking the composer to do like a YouTube thing with us or an interview or something else, we're going to pay extra for that. It's not just, okay, we commissioned you, now you got to do everything we say. If you're going to show up and have to talk to somebody, you get paid extra for that. I just wanted to make that clear to composers too. They should be asking.
That's great. Yeah, that's great. And then how much does it cost in general, broad strokes? If beyond what it costs to produce the concert, just the recording and fees.
I mean, it's tens of thousands. I will just say that for everything you can list that we need to pay for, musicians' fees, AV, for every single concert. And that's just a lot of blessed coffees asking people for money. But I am now naturally caffeinated and we're all good. So
fantastic. And then how do you make that back?
You just heard me say it. The fact that our stuff is available for free, that we're providing access, that's our number one value, that we are making relationships, and music is a language, and you as the composer, in my opinion, you can quote me on this, I feel like the composer is the yenta for the audience and stage. I think that the composer is the person who connects us all. And so that kind of thing that we've leaned so far into living composers has dramatically improved the relationship with our community individually. And so I basically just take people coffee and lunch and wine all day, every day, and ask them for money by showing what we've done. And that's the value. And it's not a transaction. And it makes a really big difference when you turn this completely on its head.
Right. Fantastic. And we are holding questions closer to the end, but I do want to clarify one thing. Someone asked if composers write pieces for free for you.
No, oh my God, no. Oh my gosh, no. We spend over $100,000 a year on commissioning just now. We're now spending over $100,000 a year. And that's on, we do 8 to 12 commissions a year. And no, we absolutely not. I'm all about paying everybody. And I lecture about that. You don't start an organization, not pay your musicians. You absolutely don't not pay your you pay your conductors. I mean, composers. Yeah.
Yes, all of the above.
Sorry, that was a big trigger button.
Well, probably because you've done such a great job of it. So thank you so much for being such a great example for how orchestras and composers can work together to get the music out there and seen, which is like absolutely what we want. So 30,000 scans and counting. So exciting. Can you talk about the QR code thing again for just a second so everyone knows what that means?
Of course. Yeah, I'm answering in chat for while I'm doing this. So yeah, we realized we had all this music up for free listening, and that in the pandemic, people were outside and the QR codes had resurged. And so we approached the Buffalo Bayou, I wish I had a map to show you, Buffalo Bayou Partnership and Park, and asked if we could plant QR codes along their trails to our music. And we curated the park with individual pieces. And then after that, we've been in different 24 parks and hospitals and schools with mood-based QR codes. So we broke our music into mood-based playlists, and now we're in different parks. What's really exciting about this, guys, is that we're becoming visual art, in that the agency is given to the listener, unlike being in a music concert where you're really just kind of trapped, honestly. You're sitting there. With visual art, you can kind of consume it at your own time. And now with QRs, with what we're doing, you can engage or not. It still lives on our website. Go look at Roku.org at the Roku on the Go page, and you can see all the different iterations. We've taken our Black composer playlist and given it to the Fifth Ward that has a mural project, and they let their muralist pick their favorite piece from that playlist, and they're putting that piece on a QR on their particular mural. There's just no end to the way that this music, which is so exciting, can be used. You know, the fact that Kevin Lau, who just did our Nightingale book and also wrote a piece for Urhu, is at this Explore Monument on Buffalo Bayou. It's just so exciting. And then on our website, Ignitions and Rescores, it goes to their website. So it's just this really idea of connection. It's my drug.
I love it. And one of the reasons why I'm so glad you're in this session is because while we're giving a whole lot of information, like enough to make anyone's eyes cross, it's also important for us to have some inspiration for how that can all come to fruition. So thank you, Alicia, for that. We're very, very grateful. And I also want to welcome Corey back to the screen here because we're going to get into Q&A. So this is also how you can reach Corey in case you would like to ask him questions, engage him, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe one of the best ways to engage Corey is to ask him questions now. So I do see a question in the chat, which is really important. So this is from Rain. And we had been previously talking about the copyright holder in terms of the copyright to the actual work itself. So Rain is asking, is there a situation when the orchestra holds the copyright for a recording of a performance as opposed to the composer holding the copyright? So we're talking about the recording now, not the work.
Okay. This is for me, this one?
This is for you.
Okay. Well, so first of all, I did notice a question, and I did want to, give a background comment. Is not all performers are subject to any union agreements. Like someone said, oh my God, I've got videos up on YouTube and I never got permission. That's totally fine if they're not union. They can consent and, verbally, they can say, great, go for it. And also not all music is under copyright. I mean, our conversation probably doesn't apply to, music of the 19th century and before, or earlier 20th century. With the question about the ownership of the recording. So if it's not a union organization, you could negotiate and say, I'm paying for it and I want to own the recording. And that in fact happens a lot, recording non-union in Europe, very common. I think there might be a couple places in America where that can happen. So that question of who owns the copyright in the recording in a non-union context is a matter of negotiation. In the union context, I believe, and you mentioned this in terms of the media rights under the IMA agreement, and I believe under a standard AFM agreement, I think, and we have local 802 online here, but under the IMA for media online uses, the orchestra has to retain ownership. As you said in your slide, it's in perpetuity, and they then are free to grant licenses for 5 years to whoever they're licensing, possibly an initial license term of 10 years, then 5-year period. So in that case, the union deal is that the orchestra must retain the copyright. In a traditional AFM orchestra recording, I do believe that the record label or whoever's paying for it can acquire the copyright. If I'm wrong, someone put in the chat, but that's my recollection just sitting here today. Not knowing the question would be asked in advance.
Of course. Thank you for that. And We had another question, which was, I believe, already answered in the chat earlier. What is the definition of local radio? So Rochelle, thank you so much for hopping into the chat and for being here. We're very grateful. Local radio being defined as broadcast from within the jurisdiction of the AFM local. So again, the distinction between the local, your local union, and then the national, which is the overall. Very good. And then there was one other question here as well, which is whether the orchestra can use 3 to 5 minutes of the work for promotional use without the permission of the composer. So Corey, let's get back into sync license and what that
Okay,
means.
so, well, yeah, it wasn't necessarily about a video, right? It could be an audio only, I believe.
Yeah, actually,
the question
great,
is
great
either-
clarification.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So copyright is in one way insanely easy. If you make a copy of someone's copyright, you, in most cases, need their permission. And so this question would go straight to the copyright owner of the music. And this is not a union question at the moment, it's a copyright owner question. And in a rental agreement from a standard commercial publisher, I can't remember, I've written them, I've written those agreements, but I didn't study up on them. I think they allow local broadcasting, webcasting. They may allow several minutes for promotional use. If they don't, then you simply ask the copyright owner, can we do this? And if you've forgotten to do that, then copyright's interesting in another way. If I own the copyright to a work and you've used 3 minutes to promote you playing that work, I'd say there's at least a 50-50 chance I won't care. You paid me to rent the work. I'm getting my ASCAP or BMI money. You've used a few minutes to promote a concert. I might never contact you. Or if I'm the copyright owner, I may choose to contact you and say, I never gave you that permission. A lot of our conversation today, especially with Alicia's amazing work, is about perceived value. Alicia's perceived value is I put the music up online for free forever. It's worth a fortune to you. Publishers or copyright owners may have a different perceived value. They may say, that's a valuable right, you should pay us for it. So I think the question may come down to that, but in case you're curious, there's no, for that question, there's nothing in the Copyright Act that says go for it, no problem.
And I'd like to say too, I mean, so much of obviously any contract is because people aren't nice. Let's just say that. But the idea that I'm curious as to why you wouldn't want 3 minutes of your piece out there. And that is why in our commissioning agreements, we have a mutual veto, right? Like if they didn't play it well and you don't want it out there, completely understand that. And that's us too. Like if it's not a piece that we're particularly interesting, I mean, there's actually nothing we play that we didn't want to put out, but I'm just saying, I understand the mutual veto, but could you answer why the person who asked this, why you didn't want, or you wouldn't want the 3 minutes promoting you? Is it because it would not be good, or I don't know?
I don't think the question was objecting to it. I think it was just asking about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, whether they can. But it is actually a really interesting question because, I want to come back, Corey, to one of our early slides where we talked about sync licensing and the fact that it is kind of a wild west out there in terms of how much people can ask for. And so I guess what I would be curious about is what are some of the factors that would go into either a composer or a publisher's mind about how they might set those fees and whether they would want to grant those permissions, because there are different circumstances, I would guess, at whatever stage the composer is at themselves and also at what stage the piece is at in terms of how many recordings it may have had so far.
Yeah, the rest of the world, thanks to COVID, is only now catching up with Roku. Because
I love you.
yeah, there's been an explosion since March 13th, 2020 of synchronization licensing, putting things online when there were no concerts. It was a desperate situation for performing groups who desperately wanted to show their donors, which is where their money comes from. One of Alicia's slides was her donors, wanted to show them we're still alive. And so, that sort of plays into the importance of it and the perception of it of each copyright owner. This, to me, ties in very strongly with what I tried to convey at the beginning, perhaps not successfully, that we're in a very rare bubble on this, all of us. because we're talking about contemporary classical music, which requires at the orchestral level tens of thousands of dollars, even for a chamber orchestra, and yet isn't, you know, in the big picture of the music industry has tiny perceived value, as every composer listening can attest to. And so, you know, much of the question is, it still goes back to this perceived importance, what the copyright owner thinks. I will say that, and again, I'm a former publisher and I live this firsthand, that composers who aspire to have a commercial publisher represent them will have to come to grips with the fact that commercial publishers are commercial and they literally have employees to pay, rent to pay, tons of expenses. And that those organizations, they do perceive value in everything because they kind of have to. You know, a company that has a lot of big expenses that represents living composers is kind of inclined to say there's value in the video beyond 6 months or whatever, and we're going to charge you for it because that's what we do. I'm not sure I've answered the question, but I think there's, you know, we're in this area where everyone loves the art, and at some point there's this friction with the money, and people have a different viewpoint of how that works. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I mean, there might be all kinds of different calculus. Everybody's going to feel differently. We've had folks on these sessions even who have very different opinions on how those fees should be negotiated and what the factors are. So it is helpful to know that those differences of opinion do exist. But in broad strokes, I would say probably, I would guess, if I were a composer, I would probably be more inclined to want a piece out there if there's no recording of it at all. You know what I mean? Or if I don't have many orchestral works recorded at all, because those are going to be things that help advance the cause of me getting more of those pieces commissioned and out there. And there may become a point in my life where, you know, if people are performing my music left and right and it's in recorded form and people have paid for that right for it to be out there recorded, having more than one thing out there maybe not as beneficial, or maybe in some ways taking attention away for something that may be out there. Those are some of the things that I've heard people say, in other words.
Exactly. Yeah. You've covered it. By the way, just really quickly, Alicia, on your comment about looking for a collective way to license synchronizations, music publishers are you know, they're subject to antitrust laws, and every time I have ever heard anybody suggest anything where music publishers get together and do something together, they always say, "Oh no, we can't do that." You know, that would be the trust. Just so you know, that's what I hear about that.
I wasn't talking about them getting together. I was talking about there was a woman who was going to bargain for, say, 5 orchestras together collectively, 2 publishers. That was what she was setting up at one point.
Right, and that actually happens with ASCAP and BMI, but they are actually subject to governmental Department of Justice controls in that process. So I just wanted to throw in there, since we're talking about everyone having a different view and the possible nirvana of it being like mechanicals, where, you know, that rate is set, that would require Congress getting involved and changing copyright law, possibly.
Okay. Well, there you go.
Interesting.
Well, I saw the question from Libby. Absolutely. Roko's all about relationships. It's not about labels. It's all about trying to give agency to the composer, the musician, the audience. So, I mean, absolutely. If I miscategorize something or someone, all my people know to call me and say, I don't identify as a woman, or I don't identify as Black. I've actually asked that list, but yeah, absolutely. If they feel like their piece does not meet the soothing category, then they could put it in the bold. I'm happy to do that.
Absolutely. And for anyone who might be listening but not able to see the chat, the question was whether the composer has any say as to if and how the music they compose for Roko is put into one of the lists. And that's an interesting topic, actually, because a lot of music creators, their music, even on platforms like Spotify, gets heard a lot more when it gets adopted by one of these playlists and played outside of the context of the album it might have been released on. So that's an interesting one. Another huge thanks to Rochelle for answering and reinforcing what Corey said about who owns a recording. So under the IMA, the orchestra employer must retain ownership. And if it's made under SRLA or another AFM commercial agreement, copyright belongs to the label or whatever entity is a signatory to that or other agreement. And that's just a reminder to say, we are very grateful to our counterparts at the local and national unions who help us understand these agreements, because there is a lot to unpack in these, and there are some really smart individuals who have both helped negotiate them and who are also a counterpart and a collaborator with orchestras to help us understand how they are all done. So Rochelle, thank you for being here. We really are
Thank you,
grateful.
Rochelle. I was relieved to see I came close to the right answer. Thank you.
So then there's a question here. If a composer contributes to pay a videographer for the concert performance, not union, or does not contribute, but the concert is video recorded and the video is placed on the YouTube channel of the producing organization, in that circumstance, to whom does this video belong, the composer or the organization? The person who's asked has heard both answers from two different organizations, which is confusing. So ultimately it's who owns it, the composer or the organization? Corey, coming to you.
Yeah, and I don't assume I'm the one with the answer because I like hearing you two speak. So copyright. All right. If someone creates a video initially, if they're doing it on their own, they own the video they created. You can negotiate with them and say, I would like you to do the video and I would like you to give me the copyright in exchange for $100. Then whoever is paying the videographer owns the copyright. If it gets more interesting if there's no clear agreement like that. The way the law, and this is incredibly common, so there are solutions to this from court cases, not in the Copyright Act necessarily, where if I make a video for you and I say to you, yeah, go ahead and put it on YouTube, then you can do that because that was the deal. I made the video, I said, put it on YouTube. We have basically a verbal agreement. I still own the copyright, but I gave you permission, and the understanding was that that's why you asked me to do the video, to put it on YouTube in the first place. And so you now have, the reason you heard two different answers is because there are two different answers. You know, in that case, I own the copyright, but I've handed it over to you for YouTube. So you've got a right to use it there.
That's fascinating. And then another question about posting. So what is the risk of posting your original music on your channel when you're only a student with no licensing agreement or ASCAP and BMI relationship and getting lots of views to get yourself out there?
If you own
How
the
do you
copyright,
prevent?
yeah, if you own the copyright, you do what you like.
So that's one question about risk, but actually the question continues to ask, how do you prevent others from using your music without your permission?
Well, in the case of YouTube, there's the famous DMCA notice and takedown. If I take your video and put it on my YouTube channel, you can send a takedown notice to YouTube and they'll probably take it down. That's one way.
One of the most frustrating things that happens to our live streams is that YouTube claims our music when we play traditional composers. It happens almost every concert. I mean, that's a little flex because you're like, oh, you sound, this is the Berlin Philharmonic. We're like, no, but thank you. You know, it's still irritating.
Definitely. So I think we've reached a point where we've answered most of the questions in here. We're very grateful, Corey, Alicia, to both of you for this conversation, both the information within, which is really only a trailhead. There's so much more to learn here. I also want to thank Joe Kluger and Michael Bronson, who have done such a beautiful job of negotiating and demystifying the IMA for those of us who are privileged to use it. So they're also a wonderful font of information. So thank you all so much for being a part of this and for joining us today. And I want to welcome Garrett back to the screen to close our session.
Yes, thank you very much, Alicia, Corey, and Melissa, for this really incredible presentation. I learned a lot. I hope each and every one of you learned a lot as well. Huge thanks to everyone who attended today. Your feedback plays a big role in the formation of our future webinars and workshops. So if you're able, please use the link that I just put in the chat to complete our short post-webinar survey. That would be highly appreciated. Another huge thanks to our Earshot partners, the American Composers Forum, New New Music USA and the League of American Orchestras. We're very grateful to the many individuals and organizations who have made Earshot possible through their support, and to ACO's artists, staff, and board for making this program a reality. For more information on Earshot, including how you can apply as a composer or to connect with us to bring the program to your orchestra, as well as a full list of our supporters, visit our website, americancomposers.org. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you again soon. Cheers.